The North African campaign of the Second World War reached a critical juncture in early April 1941. The relentless advance of General Erwin Rommel and his formidable Afrika Korps had forced British and Commonwealth troops into a desperate retreat across the unforgiving Libyan desert. The coastal town of Tobruk stood as the last defensible bastion before the Egyptian border. Possessing a vital deep-water harbor and a water filtration plant, Tobruk was an essential strategic prize. Its capture would grant the Axis forces a crucial logistical lifeline, while its successful defense could starve Rommel of vital supplies. The monumental task of holding this besieged fortress fell primarily to the 9th Australian Division, commanded by Major General Leslie Morshead. A veteran of the First World War, Morshead was an uncompromising tactician who demanded absolute discipline and unwavering resolve from his soldiers. Nicknamed Ming the Merciless by his troops, he recognized that survival depended on strict adherence to protocol and continuous labor. When the exhausted men arrived in the dilapidated town, they found the old Italian defensive perimeter in a state of severe disrepair, necessitating an immediate and grueling effort to rebuild the shattered fortifications. Corporal Thomas O'Reilly, a pragmatic infantryman hardened by the harsh conditions of the desert, marched into Tobruk with his weary unit as dust storms choked the fading daylight. The men were physically exhausted, their uniforms caked with sweat and pale sand after weeks of continuous retreat. O'Reilly stared at the shallow, collapsing trenches and the rusted coils of barbed wire that formed the perimeter's so-called red line of defense. They were ordered to start digging immediately, utilizing whatever rudimentary tools were available to deepen the defensive positions and clear the anti-tank ditches before the impending German assault. Morshead swiftly assessed the precarious tactical reality of their situation. The garrison was entirely surrounded by land, effectively isolated from the main Allied army retreating toward Egypt. The only remaining lifeline was the Mediterranean Sea, guarded by the Royal Navy, which would soon face relentless aerial bombardment from the Luftwaffe. The perimeter spanned roughly 30 miles, a vast arc of desolate desert that required constant vigilance. Morshead ordered the implementation of an active defense, refusing to let his men simply cower in their dugouts, while the enemy massed their armored columns for a concentrated breakthrough attempt. General Erwin Rommel, flushed with the momentum of his rapid victories across Cyrenaica, viewed the Tobruk garrison as a minor obstacle that would swiftly crumble before a coordinated blitzkrieg. His panzer divisions and motorized infantry units advanced with terrifying speed, employing the same lightning-fast maneuvers that had devastated European armies. The German commanders possessed supreme confidence in their mechanized superiority, entirely underestimating the stubborn resilience of the Australian infantrymen. As the heavy dust clouds of the approaching Afrika Korps appeared on the western horizon, the true gravity of the impending siege settled heavily upon the defenders. Under the unforgiving North African sun, O'Reilly and his squad labored frantically to reinforce their assigned sector of the Red Line. They hacked at the limestone bedrock with picks and shovels, raising blisters on their hands while attempting to carve out functional firing pits. The anti-tank ditch, originally constructed by the Italians, had partially filled with drifting sand and required massive physical exertion to clear. Morshead circulated among the defensive positions, his stern demeanor projecting an aura of absolute resolve. "There will be no Dunkirk here," Morshead told his officers, ensuring the message filtered down to every soldier. The psychological strain of anticipation weighed heavily on the young Australian soldiers as they watched the enemy encampments multiply across the desert landscape. Artillery shells began to sporadically impact the outer perimeter, testing the range and accuracy of the German guns. O'Reilly kept his men focused on the immediate tasks of survival, organizing watches and distributing the meager rations of canned bully beef and heavily chlorinated water. The nights were freezing, contrasting sharply with the searing daytime temperatures, further eroding the physical stamina of the troops who huddled in their shallow slit trenches under the stars. Morshead recognized that traditional static defense would prove fatal against Rommel's mobile armored units. He meticulously devised a defense-in-depth strategy, integrating scattered concrete pillboxes with deeply concealed infantry positions and perfectly sighted anti-tank artillery. The strategy hinged on a radical concept. The frontline infantry was instructed to allow the heavily armored panzers to roll straight past their hidden trenches. Once the tanks had passed, the infantry would emerge to engage the trailing German foot soldiers, effectively stripping the armor of its vital infantry support. while the heavier Allied artillery systematically targeted the isolated panzers in the rear. Initial probing attacks by German reconnaissance units tested the perimeter's strength and the garrison's reaction time. O'Reilly experienced his first taste of close combat during one of these localized skirmishes, repelling a sudden infantry push with coordinated machine gun fire and precision rifle shots. The aggressive response of the Australian defenders surprised the German vanguard, who had anticipated a demoralized and easily broken enemy. These early engagements proved crucial in building the confidence of the garrison, demonstrating that the vaunted German war machine was not invincible and that disciplined defensive tactics could effectively neutralize their rapid assaults. As the siege tightened around the port city, the stark reality of their isolation became an unavoidable presence in the daily lives of the soldiers. The Royal Air Force had been forced to withdraw its fighter squadrons from the airfield within Tobruk, leaving the skies entirely under the terrifying dominance of Axis aircraft. Formations of Stuka dive bombers began to circle overhead, their sirens shrieking as they plummeted toward the harbor facilities and supply dumps. O'Reilly watched the relentless aerial bombardments, realizing that they would have to endure this psychological and physical torment without any friendly air support. Sustaining the garrison relied entirely on the courage and skill of the sailors manning the Mediterranean supply convoys. Under the cover of darkness, destroyers and requisitioned merchant vessels braved the treacherous coastal waters, navigating through newly laid minefields and evading predatory U-boats to deliver essential ammunition, food, and medical supplies. These vital nocturnal deliveries became the lifeblood of Tobruk, allowing the defenders to replenish their rapidly depleting stockpiles. The soldiers deeply respected the immense risks taken by the naval crews, knowing that any disruption to this fragile maritime lifeline would inevitably lead to the fortress's collapse. A grim routine quickly established itself within the perimeter, governed by the unpredictable rhythm of enemy artillery barrages and the constant battle against the harsh environment. Millions of desert flies swarmed relentlessly over the trenches, attracted to the inadequate sanitation facilities and the unburied dead in the neutral zone. O'Reilly ordered his men to maintain strict hygiene standards despite the profound scarcity of fresh water, knowing that widespread disease could decimate their ranks faster than German bullets. The pervasive dust penetrated everything, jamming weapons, contaminating their meager food rations, and constantly irritating their eyes and throats. Determined to maintain the tactical initiative, Major General Morshead ordered the immediate commencement of aggressive nocturnal patrols into the dangerous expanse of no man's land. He firmly believed that the best method to defend Tobruk was to constantly harass the besiegers and dominate the space between the opposing front lines. O'Reilly found himself volunteering to lead these highly perilous missions, carefully navigating through uncharted minefields and rusted wire obstacles under the pale moonlight. The primary objectives of these stealth operations were to gather actionable intelligence, capture enemy sentries for interrogation, and inflict maximum psychological distress upon the besiegers. These nighttime encounters in the desert wasteland were characterized by sudden, terrifying moments of intense violence followed by prolonged periods of agonizing silence. O'Reilly and his squad moved like shadows across the rocky terrain, their bayonets fixed and their faces blackened with burnt cork to avoid reflection. They ambushed German working parties attempting to extend their forward trenches, relying on the element of total surprise to overwhelm the enemy before quickly retreating back to the safety of the perimeter. These constant raids forced the Axis troops to remain perpetually alert, rapidly exhausting their morale and physical reserves. Despite these successful localized disruptions, Allied intelligence confirmed that Rommel was massing a massive armored force for a definitive, overwhelming assault designed to capture Tobruk. The sounds of heavy tank engines echoing across the desert at night served as a grim reminder of the mechanized fury that awaited the defenders. Morshead meticulously reviewed his defensive dispositions, ensuring that every anti-tank gun was perfectly sighted and every infantryman fully understood their specific role in the upcoming battle. The tension within the garrison reached an almost unbearable peak as the defenders braced themselves for the inevitable onslaught. As the Easter weekend approached, the frequency and intensity of the German artillery bombardments dramatically increased, signaling the imminent commencement of the main offensive. O'Reilly sat in his reinforced dugout, meticulously cleaning the mechanism of his Lee Enfield rifle while the ground shook violently from the impact of heavy explosive shells. He spoke calmly to the younger recruits in his platoon, steadying their shattered nerves and reminding them of the precise tactical instructions they had relentlessly rehearsed. "Just keep your heads down until the armor passes, then we take the infantry," O'Reilly repeated, cementing the desperate strategy. Rommel positioned his elite panzer divisions at the perimeter's most vulnerable points, fully expecting his armored spearheads to slice through the Australian lines with minimal resistance. The German propaganda machine was already preparing victory announcements, celebrating the anticipated capture of the vital port and the subsequent destruction of the British Eighth Army. The Axis commanders believed the isolated garrison lacked the heavy weaponry and the sheer combat fortitude required to withstand a coordinated, modern mechanized assault. They had not yet comprehended the unique resilience and the innovative defensive doctrines forged by Morshead and his hardened Australian infantry. Inside the besieged fortress, a profound sense of grim determination settled over the defending troops as they prepared to face the ultimate test of their courage. The medical personnel established emergency casualty clearing stations in the deeply excavated tunnel networks, preparing to receive the inevitable influx of severely wounded soldiers. Ammunition was strategically stockpiled near the primary defensive posts, ensuring the machine gunners and anti-tank crews would not run dry during the critical moments of the engagement. Every man understood that there was absolutely nowhere to retreat. They had to hold the line or face total annihilation. The defining moment finally arrived in the pre-dawn darkness of Easter Sunday, as a colossal artillery barrage illuminated the desert sky with blinding flashes of explosive light. O'Reilly gripped his weapon tightly, the deafening roar of the bombardment drowning out all other sounds as the earth heaved beneath his boots. The distinct, terrifying rumble of hundreds of approaching tank tracks reverberated through the limestone bedrock, signaling the beginning of the most desperate and crucial engagement of the campaign. The gathering storm had finally broken over Tobruk, plunging the isolated garrison into a terrifying crucible of mechanized warfare. As the dust clouds raised by the advancing panzer formations obscured the early morning sun, the Australian defenders maintained absolute discipline in their hidden positions. Morshead's explicit orders echoed in their minds, commanding them to hold their fire until the enemy was within point-blank range to maximize the lethal impact. O'Reilly watched through his periscope as the monstrous shapes of the German tanks emerged from the swirling dust, their heavy cannons swiveling as they searched for targets. The infantrymen remained completely motionless in their trenches, enduring the agonizing psychological pressure of allowing the enemy armor to approach unimpeded. This immense display of tactical restraint perfectly exemplified the iron discipline instilled by Major General Morshead throughout the entire 9th Australian Division. They were not merely surviving the brutal desert conditions, they were actively preparing to execute a complex and highly dangerous maneuver against a vastly superior armored force. The fate of the entire North African campaign rested squarely on the weary shoulders of these isolated defenders, completely cut off from the outside world. As the first enemy tank breached the outer perimeter wire, O'Reilly took a deep breath, ready to face the overwhelming wrath of the Afrika Korps. The Easter weekend of 1941 commenced with a terrifying crescendo of violence that shattered the desert morning. General Rommel directed his Afrika Korps to breach the southern sector of the Tobruk perimeter, concentrating his formidable mechanized strength against the Red Line defenses. The Australian infantrymen, including Corporal Thomas O'Reilly, braced themselves in their shallow dugouts as the heavy artillery barrage intensified, raining high explosives upon the scattered concrete posts. The deafening roar of the approaching German panzer divisions echoed across the barren landscape, heralding the arrival of a seemingly unstoppable armored juggernaut. As the dust clouds parted, the monstrous silhouettes of the German tanks materialized before the Australian positions, their tracks churning the dry limestone bedrock into a blinding storm. O'Reilly grasped his rifle tightly, his knuckles turning white as he watched the mechanized behemoths advance toward the anti-tank ditch. The sheer psychological terror of facing armored vehicles with mere infantry weapons tested the absolute limits of their courage. The young soldiers remained remarkably still, perfectly executing Major General Morshead's unconventional and highly dangerous defensive strategy, despite their overwhelming fear. The vanguard of the German armor reached the anti-tank ditch, finding makeshift crossings previously prepared by their combat engineers under the cover of darkness. The massive panzers began to rumble over the obstacles, completely bypassing the concealed Australian infantry trenches just as Moorehead had meticulously planned. O'Reilly and his men huddled in the suffocating heat of their dugouts, listening to the terrifying clatter of metal treads passing mere yards from their heads. The ground shook violently, threatening to collapse the reinforced sandbag walls of their fragile underground sanctuaries as the heavy machines rolled relentlessly forward. "Hold your fire, wait for the bloody infantry," O'Reilly whispered harshly to his trembling squad, enforcing the strict fire discipline that was their only hope of survival. The German tank commanders, peering through their narrow vision slits, erroneously believed they had successfully penetrated a demoralized and abandoned defensive line. They surged deeper into the Tobruk perimeter, entirely unaware that the heavily armed Australian defenders were quietly waiting in their rear. The tactical deception worked flawlessly, perfectly separating the advancing enemy armor from their crucial motorized infantry support elements that were following closely behind the tanks. The moment the trailing German infantry units entered the kill zone, the Australian positions suddenly erupted with a devastating storm of coordinated machine gun and rifle fire. O'Reilly rose from his concealed trench, seamlessly acquiring targets and discharging his weapon with practiced lethal efficiency alongside his fellow soldiers. The completely stunned German foot soldiers were instantly pinned down in the featureless desert, entirely exposed to the relentless enfilading fire from the hidden pillboxes. Without their armored shields, the enemy infantry suffered catastrophic casualties as they desperately scrambled for any available cover in the unforgiving terrain. Simultaneously, the isolated German panzers that had penetrated deep into the Australian rear encountered Moorehead's carefully sighted heavy anti-tank artillery batteries. The heavy guns unleashed a blistering barrage of armor-piercing shells at point-blank range, systematically decimating the completely unsupported enemy tank formations. Plumes of thick black smoke soon billowed into the azure sky as the supposedly invincible German fighting machines were brutally reduced to burning wreckage. The brilliant defensive ambush effectively neutralized Rommel's primary assault force, proving that the blitzkrieg tactics could be halted by disciplined and resolute infantry. Retreating in utter confusion, the surviving German infantrymen desperately attempted to withdraw through the devastating crossfire that swept across the shattered red line. O'Reilly relentlessly directed his squad's heavy weapons, ensuring that the enemy forces could not easily reorganize or launch an immediate localized counterattack. The once confident Afrika Korps had suffered a humiliating tactical defeat, leaving dozens of destroyed vehicles and hundreds of casualties scattered across the sandy battlefield. The Australian defenders had successfully executed one of the most remarkable defensive victories of the early war, completely shattering the myth of German mechanized invincibility. Following the decisive repulse of the Easter assault, a profound sense of exhausted triumph permeated the dusty trenches of the besieged Tobruk garrison. Major General Moorehead quickly toured the battered forward positions, offering stoic nods of grim approval to the weary but immensely proud infantrymen who had held the line. "You did exactly what was required, men. Now prepare for the next wave," Moorehead stated plainly. Recognizing that Rommel would inevitably return with overwhelming force, the soldiers immediately began repairing their damaged fortifications, acutely aware that this brutal engagement was merely the beginning of a prolonged siege. In the immediate aftermath of the failed offensive, the infamous German propagandist known as Lord Haw broadcasted a highly derisive message directed at the Australian defenders. Over the crackling radio frequencies, his sneering, aristocratic voice echoed through the dimly lit dugouts, mockingly describing the isolated garrison as being caught like rats in a trap. The Nazi propaganda ministry intended the cruel insult to severely damage the morale of the besieged soldiers who were enduring horrific combat conditions. They completely misunderstood the dark, self-deprecating humor and the immense resilience that characterized the unique culture of the Australian infantrymen. Rather than succumbing to despair, O'Reilly and his fellow soldiers enthusiastically embraced the intended insult, transforming it into a fierce badge of profound military honor. They proudly christened themselves the Rats of Tobruk, adopting the defiant moniker as a symbol of their stubborn endurance and their ability to survive underground. Resourceful soldiers quickly began crafting small metal rat insignias from the brass casings of discarded artillery shells, pinning them to their faded khaki uniforms. This spontaneous act of unified defiance significantly bolstered the psychological fortitude of the entire garrison, forging an unbreakable bond among the weary defenders. The newly named Rats of Tobruk firmly established their defensive dominance by significantly expanding their aggressive nocturnal patrolling operations across the perilous no-man's land. Morse had correctly deduced that a purely static defense would eventually crumble under the continuous pressure of Rommel's superior siege artillery and relentless aerial bombardments. O'Reilly frequently led his battle-hardened squad into the freezing desert nights, meticulously mapping enemy minefields and launching sudden, devastating raids on sleeping German encampments. These continuous aggressive actions kept the besieging Axis forces in a constant state of severe psychological distress and extreme physical exhaustion. During one particularly harrowing night patrol, O'Reilly's unit successfully ambushed an Italian supply convoy, attempting to reinforce a forward observation post near the perimeter. The brief but intensely violent skirmish resulted in the capture of several vital prisoners and the acquisition of crucial intelligence regarding upcoming enemy troop movements. Returning to the safety of their trenches just before dawn, the exhausted Australians handed their captives over to the intelligence officers for immediate and thorough interrogation. These small tactical victories accumulated over time, steadily eroding the offensive capabilities of the significantly larger forces surrounding the isolated desert fortress. The sheer brutality of the desert environment proved to be as formidable an adversary as the German artillery that constantly pounded the fragile defensive perimeter. As the scorching North African summer approached, the daily temperatures soared to unbearable heights, turning the shallow slit trenches into suffocating, heat-radiating ovens. O'Reilly ruthlessly enforced strict water rationing among his men, carefully measuring out the meager allowance of foul-tasting, heavily chlorinated water delivered nightly by supply trucks. Severe dehydration and widespread dysentery rapidly depleted the fighting strength of the garrison, forcing sick men to remain on active combat duty. The relentless plague of desert flies exacerbated the horrific living conditions, swarming in dense black clouds around the latrines and the unburied corpses decaying in the neutral zone. The insects constantly tormented the exhausted soldiers, crawling into their eyes and mouths the moment they attempted to catch a few fleeting hours of restless sleep. Sandstorms frequently swept across the desolate landscape, coating weapons, contaminating rations, and causing painful abrasions on the exposed skin of the weary infantrymen. Despite these horrific environmental challenges, the Rats of Tobruk maintained their grim determination to hold the strategically vital port. The Luftwaffe continuously exploited their absolute aerial supremacy, subjecting the garrison and the heart. O'Reilly deeply despised the distinct, wailing siren of the approaching aircraft, an agonizing sound that inevitably preceded a devastating rain of high-explosive bombs. The defenders could only huddle helplessly in their deep dugouts, praying that the reinforced roofs would withstand the direct hits that frequently obliterated adjacent fighting positions. The psychological toll of enduring these unopposed aerial assaults severely tested the mental endurance of every soldier. Despite the unrelenting pressure from both the enemy and the harsh environment, the strict discipline enforced by Major General Morsehead never wavered for a single moment. He frequently inspected the front lines, demanding that the men regularly shave and maintain their weapons in pristine condition despite the severe shortage of water. This unwavering insistence on military standards prevented the garrison from descending into demoralized apathy, forcing the soldiers to maintain their pride and combat readiness. O'Reilly deeply respected the tough commander, recognizing that Morsehead's uncompromising leadership was the primary reason the fortress had not yet fallen. Rommel, increasingly frustrated by his inability to crush the stubborn Australian resistance, continuously shifted his forces in search of a fatal weakness in the defensive perimeter. The German commander recognized that bypassing Tobruk while leaving a heavily armed enemy force on his crucial supply lines was a massive strategic liability. He ordered his heavy siege artillery to systematically bombard the harbor facilities, desperately attempting to sever the vital maritime lifeline maintained by the courageous Royal Navy. The relentless shelling constantly destroyed supply dumps and severely damaged the vital water distillation plant, pushing the defenders closer to starvation. The courageous crews of the Mediterranean fleet continued to risk their lives nightly, navigating treacherous, mine-infested waters to deliver essential ammunition and evacuate the wounded. O'Reilly often watched the sleek silhouettes of the destroyers slipping quietly into the ruined harbor under the protective cover of total darkness, marveling at their bravery. The sailors rapidly unloaded their precious cargo while dodging incoming artillery fire, knowing that their swift departure before dawn was absolutely critical for their survival. This fragile connection to the outside world provided the only tangible hope for the isolated and battered Rats of Tobruk. As the siege stretched into its third agonizing month, the relentless war of attrition began to heavily impact the physical and mental state of the troops. The continuous lack of fresh vegetables and proper nutrition led to widespread outbreaks of desert sores, painful skin infections that stubbornly refused to heal in the unsanitary conditions. O'Reilly carefully bandaged the festering wounds of his comrades, offering quiet words of encouragement while privately acknowledging his own rapidly deteriorating physical strength. They were surviving solely on sheer willpower and a profound sense of mutual loyalty forged in the crucible of continuous combat. General Rommel finally realized that completely subjugating the fortress would require a massive, meticulously coordinated offensive that he could not immediately launch due to supply shortages. The Afrika Korps reluctantly settled into a prolonged siege, constructing their own elaborate defensive fortifications to contain the highly aggressive and utterly unpredictable Australian garrison. The brutal conflict transitioned into a deadly, grinding stalemate, characterized by constant artillery duels, terrifying sniper fire, and vicious nocturnal skirmishes in the featureless desert wasteland. The true test of endurance had only just begun for the defiant soldiers stubbornly holding the critical port of Tobruk. The harsh North African summer of 1941 transformed the besieged Tobruk perimeter into a sweltering crucible of immense physical suffering. Scorching winds swept across the barren desert landscape, relentlessly driving suffocating clouds of fine dust into every shallow trench and reinforced dugout. Corporal Thomas O'Reilly and his exhausted infantrymen endured daily temperatures that frequently exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, turning their subterranean shelters into veritable ovens. The brutal war of attrition had officially commenced, shifting the tactical reality from repelling massive mechanized assaults to surviving a daily, agonizing grind of environmental and psychological torment. Severe physical deterioration rapidly plagued the stubborn Australian defenders as the siege dragged on through the unforgiving summer months. A desperate shortage of fresh water mandated incredibly strict rationing protocols, limiting each soldier to a mere few pints of foul, heavily chlorinated liquid per day. This chronic dehydration, combined with a profoundly inadequate diet of canned bully beef, inevitably led to widespread outbreaks of debilitating dysentery and painful desert sores. O'Reilly carefully wrapped his infected, festering wounds with soiled bandages, grimly acknowledging the agonizing reality that minor abrasions could quickly escalate into life-threatening medical emergencies. Millions of persistent desert flies swarmed relentlessly over the sprawling defensive perimeter, exacerbating the already horrific sanitary conditions. The insects bred prolifically in the shallow latrines and fed upon the unburied corpses that tragically littered the contested expanse of no man's land. The buzzing black clouds descended upon the exhausted troops the moment they opened a tin of rations or attempted to catch a fleeting moment of restless sleep. O'Reilly constantly swatted the vile pests away from his face, aggressively reminding his deteriorating squad that maintaining strict hygiene was absolutely vital to preventing total epidemiological collapse. The undeniable terror of the daily aerial bombardments severely compounded the immense physical miseries endured by the trapped garrison. Without any Allied fighter squadrons available to contest the skies above the fortress, formations of German Stuka dive bombers operated with absolute impunity. The chilling, mechanical shriek of their sirens systematically preceded devastating rains of high explosives that pulverized the defensive earthworks and shattered the nerves of the defenders. O'Reilly crouched low in his violently shaking trench, pressing his hands fiercely against his ears, while praying the reinforced timber roof would withstand the cataclysmic, deafening concussions. Following the terrifying aerial assaults, Rommel's heavy siege artillery systematically pounded the Australian positions in a relentless effort to completely break their morale. The continuous, concussive thud of incoming shells reverberated through the limestone bedrock, forcing the men to remain buried deep underground for hours on end. The Axis gunners explicitly targeted the vital water distillation plant and the fragile harbor facilities, attempting to completely sever the fragile maritime logistical lifeline. The constant threat of sudden, violent death hung heavily over the dusty encampment, demanding extraordinary mental resilience from the weary soldiers manning the shattered front line. In the face of this overwhelming barrage and severe environmental hardship, Major General Leslie Morsehead maintained an absolute iron grip on military discipline. He fully understood that idle troops confined to squalid trenches would rapidly succumb to profound despair and dangerous apathy. Therefore, The uncompromising commander explicitly ordered continuous improvements to the defensive fortifications, forcing the exhausted men to dig deeper and construct more robust firing positions. Discipline is the absolute foundation of our survival here, Morsehead sternly informed his subordinate officers, ensuring that regular weapon inspections and strict shaving routines were rigorously enforced daily. Morsehead vehemently rejected the traditional military concept of a passive, static defense, which he believed would eventually invite certain destruction. Instead, he pioneered a highly aggressive tactical doctrine designed to constantly harass the besieging Afrika Korps and actively dominate the perilous space between the opposing armies. He reasoned that keeping the Axis forces perpetually off balance would significantly hinder their ability to effectively organize another massive, coordinated breakthrough attempt. This audacious strategy fundamentally relied on conducting relentless, highly dangerous nocturnal patrols deep into the unmapped, heavily mined expanse of no man's land every single night. Despite his severe physical exhaustion, Corporal O'Reilly consistently volunteered to lead these terrifying stealth missions into the hostile desert darkness. He preferred the sharp, adrenaline-fueled tension of offensive action over the agonizing, helpless reality of sitting passively under continuous enemy artillery bombardment. Carefully blackening his face with burnt cork and wrapping his bayonet scabbard in thick burlap to prevent metallic rattling, he meticulously prepared his hand-picked squad for the perilous incursions. The men thoroughly understood the extreme risks involved, knowing that a single misplaced footstep in a concealed minefield could instantly result in catastrophic casualties. Navigating the treacherous terrain of no man's land required immense skill, iron nerves, and an intimate understanding of the desolate desert topography. O'Reilly and his seasoned infantrymen moved silently under the pale moonlight, utilizing the sparse scrub brush and shallow rocky depressions for crucial visual concealment. They meticulously plotted the exact locations of newly established German machine gun nests, carefully avoiding the tripwires and booby traps that densely littered the sandy approaches to the enemy lines. The absolute silence of the desert night was frequently broken by the sudden, terrifying pop of illuminating enemy flare cartridges. Whenever a brilliant magnesium flare abruptly illuminated the battlefield, the Australian patrol instantly froze, instinctively dropping flat against the cold, rocky ground. They remained absolutely motionless, holding their collective breath as the glaring white light slowly drifted downward beneath its small parachute, casting long, deceiving shadows across the sand. O'Reilly silently prayed that the nervous Italian or German sentries peering into the darkness would fail to spot their prone silhouettes. Once the flare finally extinguished, plunging the landscape back into total darkness, the squad cautiously resumed their agonizingly slow, deliberate crawl toward the enemy trenches. The primary objective of these localized raids was rarely to capture ground, but rather to inflict maximum psychological distress and gather vital intelligence. Upon reaching an isolated Axis listening post, O'Reilly would silently signal his men to initiate a sudden, overwhelmingly violent assault, utilizing grenades and bayonets. The brutal, close-quarters combat was usually concluded within minutes, relying entirely on the element of absolute surprise to rapidly overcome the completely stunned defenders. Before the enemy could effectively organize a coherent counterattack, the Australian raiders would vanish back into the confusing darkness, carrying captured weapons and crucial documents. Securing live prisoners for thorough intelligence interrogation was another critical mandate of these highly dangerous nocturnal excursions into hostile territory. During one particularly successful stealth operation, O'Reilly's squad managed to silently ambush an unwary German working party attempting to quietly lay fresh communication wires. With precise coordination, the Australians quickly subdued the completely terrified soldiers without firing a single shot, effectively avoiding the immediate attention of adjacent enemy machine gun pits. "Keep absolutely quiet and move fast," O'Reilly harshly whispered to the captured men, aggressively prodding them forward with his bayonet as they began the perilous withdrawal. The actionable intelligence extracted from these terrified captives proved absolutely invaluable to Major General Morsehead and his dedicated strategic planning staff. The prisoners frequently revealed highly detailed information regarding severe supply shortages, rapidly declining morale, and specific troop rotations within the besieging Axis formations. This crucial data allowed the Australian artillery batteries to accurately target vulnerable enemy supply dumps and specifically disrupt planned German tactical maneuvers before they could fully materialize. O'Reilly felt a profound sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that their terrifying nightly risks directly translated into a tangible tactical advantage for the besieged garrison. The relentless frequency and overwhelming ferocity of these nocturnal raids severely eroded the combat effectiveness and psychological stability of the Axis troops. The German and Italian infantrymen quickly developed a profound, paralyzing fear of the darkness, knowing that the lethal rats of Tobruk were constantly prowling just beyond their barbed wire. Sentries frequently fired blindly into the empty desert, plagued by extreme exhaustion and terrifying auditory hallucinations brought on by severe nervous strain. This constant state of heightened, agonizing anxiety completely deprived the besiegers of crucial rest, effectively degrading their overall operational readiness and offensive capabilities. General Erwin Rommel grew increasingly infuriated by the highly disruptive tactics continuously employed by the defiant Australian infantrymen defending the perimeter. His elite Afrika Korps, previously accustomed to dictating the rapid pace of mobile warfare, found themselves completely bogged down in a miserable, static war of attrition. The renowned Desert Fox issued strict orders demanding heightened nighttime security and immediate, aggressive counter-patrols to effectively neutralize the brazen Australian incursions. However, the heavily burdened Axis troops consistently struggled to match the exceptional stealth, ruthless ferocity, and intimate nocturnal terrain knowledge possessed by O'Reilly and his fellow seasoned veterans. Despite their undeniable tactical success, the continuous aggressive patrolling extracted a horrific physical and emotional toll on the severely depleted Australian forces. The immense stress of operating under constant threat of sudden death significantly accelerated the profound mental exhaustion that already plagued the malnourished soldiers. O'Reilly watched helplessly as his close comrades were abruptly killed by hidden anti-personnel mines or severely wounded by unpredictable bursts of enemy defensive fire. The agonizing cries of wounded men stranded in no man's land deeply haunted his fleeting moments of sleep, cementing the grim, unforgiving reality of their desperate situation. In the dark, suffocating confines of their subterranean shelters, the profound concept of Australian mateship became the absolute bedrock of their survival. The men shared their meager, heavily rationed water supplies, tenderly dressed each other's festering wounds, and offered quiet, steadfast support during moments of overwhelming psychological despair. O'Reilly continuously utilized dark, distinctly cynical humor to effectively deflect the paralyzing fear that constantly threatened to completely consume his battered squad. This unbreakable bond of mutual reliance and shared suffering forged a uniquely resilient fighting force capable of enduring seemingly impossible levels of sustained environmental and combat hardship. Daylight hours offered absolutely no genuine respite from the pervasive, lethal danger that constantly enveloped the sprawling defensive perimeter. Highly skilled German snipers patiently occupied, concealed, elevated positions overlooking the Australian trenches, waiting motionless for hours to target any careless movement. Even a momentary lapse in concentration, such as raising a helmet slightly above the protective sandbags, could instantly invite a fatal, high-velocity bullet. The troops were forced to move cautiously through deeply excavated communication trenches, perpetually hunched over to avoid the incredibly accurate, lethal fire that continuously suppressed the entire front line throughout the blistering afternoon. Violent seasonal sandstorms, known locally as the Khamsin, periodically engulfed the besieged fortress in terrifying, impenetrable walls of swirling, abrasive dust. These massive atmospheric disturbances temporarily halted all military operations, grounding the dreaded Stuka dive bombers and silencing the continuous, concussive artillery duels. However, the suffocating storms brought severe misery to the infantrymen, clogging their desperately needed respiratory tracts and thoroughly jamming the intricate mechanical actions of their crucial firearms. O'Reilly spent these agonizing, dark hours meticulously disassembling and cleaning his weapon, fully aware that a jammed rifle during a sudden enemy trench raid meant absolute, certain death. The critical maritime supply convoys operated by the courageous Royal Navy faced increasingly desperate challenges as the brutal siege extended into late summer. The persistent Axis aerial bombardment of the ruined harbor facilities made the nocturnal unloading of vital cargo an incredibly hazardous and chaotic undertaking. Essential shipments of heavy ammunition, fresh medical supplies, and desperately needed troop reinforcements were frequently delayed or entirely destroyed by accurate enemy fire. O'Reilly and his men acutely felt the immediate consequences of these logistical disruptions, carefully counting every single rifle, cartridge, and subsisting on strictly reduced, heavily compromised food rations. As August slowly transitioned into September, the sheer cumulative weight of the relentless attrition severely tested the ultimate breaking point of the garrison. The 9th Australian Division had suffered devastating casualties, and the surviving troops were thoroughly exhausted, profoundly malnourished, and suffering from numerous untreated physical ailments. Major General Morshead recognized that his magnificent men could not maintain this superhuman level of defensive intensity indefinitely without substantial relief or reinforcement. Yet, despite the overwhelming suffering and agonizing physical decay, the unbreakable spirit of the renowned Rats of Tobruk remained fiercely defiant against the surrounding German military might. O'Reilly stood quietly in his observation post, gazing out across the cratered, moonlit expanse of the deadly desert wasteland that separated the armies. He firmly grasped the wooden stock of his reliable rifle, his heavily bandaged hands serving as a stark, painful testament to the brutal months of continuous conflict. Rumors of a massive Axis buildup near a highly contested sector known as the Salient had begun circulating through the dusty communication trenches. The weary corporal deeply inhaled the cool night air, mentally preparing his exhausted body and shattered nerves for the horrific, inevitable escalation of violence. The strategic situation around the besieged perimeter shifted dramatically as autumn approached, focusing intensely on a heavily contested sector known as the Salient. This dangerous indentation in the Australian defensive line had been violently carved out by a previous German armored thrust and remained a bleeding wound. General Erwin Rommel recognized this critical vulnerability, massing his veteran Afrika Korps infantry and heavy artillery to exploit the geographic advantage. Corporal Thomas O'Reilly and his severely depleted squad were abruptly redeployed to this terrifying sector, fully understanding that the enemy intended to crush the fortress here. The physical landscape of the salient was a nightmare of shattered limestone, tangled barbed wire, and hastily excavated trenches filled with pulverized rock. Opposing forces were separated by incredibly narrow margins, sometimes mere yards of contested dirt where whispered conversations of the enemy could be clearly heard. O'Reilly immediately ordered his exhausted men to deepen their newly assigned fighting pits, knowing that the shallow depressions offered completely inadequate protection against mortars. The oppressive heat compounded their immense suffering, turning the confined, dusty spaces into suffocating ovens that rapidly drained their remaining physical strength. Major General Leslie Morshead continuously inspected the precarious positions within the salient, projecting an aura of absolute determination despite the overwhelming tactical disadvantage. He explicitly commanded his subordinate officers to fiercely contest every single inch of ground, completely refusing to authorize any further tactical withdrawals. Heavy machine guns were meticulously sighted to create devastating, overlapping fields of interlocking fire across the narrow strip of no man's land. Morshead fully understood that if Rommel successfully widened this critical breach, the entire defensive perimeter of Tobruk would inevitably collapse under the concentrated mechanized weight. The anticipated Axis offensive commenced with an earth-shattering artillery bombardment that severely eclipsed any previous barrage experienced by the beleaguered Australian defenders. High explosive shells rained down upon the salient with terrifying, relentless precision, instantly obliterating several forward observation posts and completely burying heavily reinforced bunkers. O'Reilly and his terrified squad huddled together at the absolute bottom of their violently shaking trench, desperately praying for survival amidst the deafening chaos. The incredibly intense concussion waves repeatedly knocked the breath from their lungs, while suffocating clouds of pulverized dust effectively blinded the entire front line. As the devastating barrage abruptly lifted, the eerie silence was instantly shattered by the terrifying, synchronized screams of advancing German and Italian infantrymen. Hundreds of enemy soldiers surged forward across the ruined, cratered landscape, desperately utilizing the dense smoke and swirling dust for vital visual concealment. O'Reilly violently shook the paralyzing dirt from his rifle mechanism, urgently screaming at his dazed men to immediately man the firing steps. The brutal reality of close-quarters combat was imminent, and the heavily outnumbered Australians rapidly prepared to unleash a devastating torrent of coordinated defensive firepower. The relentless attackers violently crashed into the fragile perimeter, completely transforming the narrow trenches into chaotic arenas of absolute, terrifying savage butchery. Bayonets viciously clashed against hardened steel helmets, while desperate men fiercely wrestled in the suffocating heat of the deep, pulverized limestone pits. O'Reilly fired his reliable weapon at point-blank range, instantly dropping a charging German soldier before forcefully driving his heavy rifle butt into another attacker. The sheer, overwhelming ferocity of the Australian defense temporarily halted the initial enemy momentum, transforming the coordinated assault into a fragmented, bloody brawl. For several agonizing hours, the completely desperate struggle within the contested salient raged without any significant pause or noticeable tactical resolution. The baking sun relentlessly scorched the exhausted combatants, exacerbating their severe dehydration and intensifying the horrific stench of spilled blood and ruptured earth. Ammunition rapidly dwindled on both sides, forcing the weary soldiers to frequently scavenge usable weapons and crucial grenades from the countless fallen bodies. O'Reilly ruthlessly directed his surviving men, screaming hoarse, desperate commands to effectively plug the dangerous gaps constantly opening within their rapidly crumbling defensive line. The immense physical toll of the brutal engagement quickly became devastatingly apparent as the shallow communication trenches filled completely with severely wounded soldiers. Medical orderlies bravely crawled through the relentless crossfire, desperately dragging bleeding men toward the heavily reinforced subterranean casualty clearing stations. O'Reilly felt a profound, agonizing surge of emotional grief as he witnessed his closest friends brutally cut down by accurate enemy machine gun fire. However, the absolute necessity of immediate survival completely suppressed his mourning, forcing him to aggressively continue fighting amidst the horrifying, seemingly endless slaughter. Recognizing the extreme tactical peril developing within the crumbling salient, Major General Morsehead decisively committed his heavily guarded, precious infantry reserves. These relatively fresh Australian troops rapidly moved forward through the heavily bombarded communication zones, bringing desperately needed ammunition and renewed fighting spirit. Their sudden, aggressive arrival onto the chaotic battlefield provided a crucial, stabilizing force that effectively prevented a catastrophic, total collapse of the perimeter. O'Reilly viciously cheered their timely appearance, instantly feeling a renewed surge of stubborn determination flood through his completely exhausted, severely battered body. Bolstered by the vital reinforcements, the fiercely defiant Rats of Tobruk immediately launched a massive, violently coordinated counterattack against the German penetrations. Bayonets fixed, the shouting Australian infantrymen aggressively surged over their shattered sandbags, charging directly into the completely stunned, advancing enemy formations. The sheer, unexpected ferocity of this localized offensive completely shattered the Axis momentum, forcefully driving the exhausted attackers back toward their original starting lines. O'Reilly mercilessly led the brutal charge in his sector, viciously reclaiming the heavily contested, blood-soaked trenches yard by agonizing yard. As night completely enveloped the horrific battlefield, the intense combat finally subsided into a tense, heavily armed standoff amidst the ruined fortifications. The fiercely contested salient remained firmly in Australian hands, although the deeply excavated defensive lines had been severely mauled and slightly repositioned. Both exhausted armies utilized the crucial darkness to desperately evacuate their massive numbers of casualties and furiously rebuild their shattered frontline defenses. The deafening silence that followed the horrific slaughter felt completely unnatural, heavily saturated with the metallic, undeniable stench of widespread death. Corporal O'Reilly completely collapsed against the cold dirt wall of his heavily damaged trench, his entire body violently trembling from extreme physical exertion. He slowly wiped the thick mixture of dried blood and pulverized limestone dust from his hollow face, completely unable to genuinely comprehend his survival. Only a mere handful of his original, veteran squad members had actually lived through the horrifying, concentrated massacre of the brutal afternoon assault. He quietly offered a desperate, silent prayer for the fallen men, acutely aware that the relentless siege was still far from completely over. The profound psychological impact of the horrific battle of the salient severely tested the ultimate mental endurance of the defiant Australian garrison. The men had been forcefully pushed beyond the absolute limits of normal human suffering, continuously fighting in apocalyptic conditions without proper rest or nutrition. Nightmares frequently plagued their brief moments of sleep, filled entirely with the terrifying sounds of screaming metal and dying, profoundly suffering comrades. Yet, despite the immense trauma, An undeniable, unbreakable bond of shared resilience fiercely unified the completely exhausted survivors holding the shattered perimeter. General Erwin Rommel privately acknowledged the bitter, undeniable reality that his elite forces had completely failed to decisively crush the stubborn Tobruk garrison. The fiercely defended salient had effectively become a horrific, bloody meat grinder, severely depleting his highly valued veteran infantry without yielding any strategic advantage. He reluctantly suspended all massive frontal assaults, fully recognizing that completely annihilating the deeply entrenched Australians would require substantially more mechanized resources than currently available. The brutal siege strictly reverted to a harrowing, continuous bombardment designed to slowly starve the defenders into final submission. Within the besieged fortress, the absolute primary focus drastically shifted toward desperately awaiting the heavily promised arrival of a massive British relief force. Intelligence briefings frequently circulated rumors that the mighty Eighth Army was successfully regrouping near the Egyptian border, aggressively preparing for a massive offensive. O'Reilly constantly scrutinized the hazy eastern horizon, desperately searching for any faint sign of friendly dust clouds, signaling their ultimate salvation. The incredibly agonizing, prolonged wait severely tested the severely depleted patience of the battered men who had already sacrificed so profoundly. The magnificent 9th Australian Division had proudly accomplished the seemingly impossible, completely halting the previously unstoppable mechanized advance of the dreaded Afrika Korps. However, this profound strategic victory had extracted an incredibly horrific, unsustainable cost in both human lives and overall physical health across the garrison. The Australian government abruptly grew deeply concerned about the severe deterioration of their elite frontline troops, aggressively demanding their immediate evacuation from the fortress. Major General Morshead firmly agreed, knowing his completely exhausted veterans urgently required extensive rest and crucial medical rehabilitation. Intense diplomatic friction quickly erupted between the highly protective Australian government and the primary British High Command regarding the proposed large-scale maritime evacuation. Prime Minister Winston Churchill desperately wanted the highly experienced Australians to remain firmly entrenched in Tobruk to support the upcoming massive Allied offensive. He strongly argued that attempting a heavily contested naval withdrawal would inevitably disrupt complex strategic planning and potentially risk valuable Mediterranean fleet assets. Despite these severe pressures, the absolute necessity of preserving the surviving men completely dominated the final, decisive political resolution. A highly classified operational plan was meticulously formulated to systematically replace the severely battered Australians with entirely fresh British and Polish infantry units. The incredibly perilous maritime operation strictly required absolute secrecy, entirely relying on moonless nights to successfully transport thousands of replacement troops undetected. O'Reilly and his completely exhausted squad received heavily guarded whispers that they would soon abandon the horrific trenches they had fiercely defended. The unbelievable prospect of finally leaving the accursed desert fortress generated a profoundly conflicting mixture of profound relief and deep guilt. The final days, completely occupying the severely damaged defensive perimeter, were heavily saturated with immense tension and profoundly quiet, somber reflection. O'Reilly meticulously packed his incredibly sparse personal belongings, carefully wrapping the small, brass rat insignia he had proudly crafted months earlier. He slowly walked through the deeply pulverized communication trenches, heavily pausing to silently observe the makeshift wooden crosses marking countless shallow graves. Leaving their profoundly respected, fallen comrades behind in the unforgiving desert completely broke the hardened hearts of the surviving, defiant infantrymen. Major General Morshead addressed his completely exhausted troops in strictly organized, highly concealed small groups to effectively avoid drawing fatal artillery fire. He proudly commended their absolute, unwavering courage and incredibly fierce endurance, deeply acknowledging the horrific, unimaginable sacrifices they had successfully endured. "You have completely shown the entire world that this relentless enemy can indeed be definitively stopped," Morshead strongly declared, his voice thick with genuine emotion. The hardened soldiers listened silently, their heavily dirt-streaked faces reflecting profound pride amidst the total, overwhelming exhaustion. Under the incredibly protective cover of total darkness, completely fresh British soldiers began silently filtering into the heavily contested frontline positions. O'Reilly quietly handed over his extremely detailed defensive maps and heavily used firing sectors, offering crucial, grim advice regarding specific sniper threats. The incoming troops stared completely wide-eyed at the utterly devastated landscape, clearly terrified by the incredibly horrifying conditions the Australians had somehow survived. The incredibly swift, strictly disciplined transition was completely vital to ensuring the defensive perimeter remained entirely secure during the vulnerable handover. As the completely exhausted Rats of Tobruk slowly marched toward the heavily bombarded harbor, they heavily carried the undeniable legacy of true defiance. They had successfully defended the incredibly vital strategic port against seemingly impossible odds, completely changing the entire trajectory of the desert campaign. O'Reilly strongly gripped his rifle, deeply knowing the brutal global war was absolutely far from over, yet feeling incredibly proud of their immense survival. The horrific battle of the salient had severely tested them, forcefully cementing their legendary, unbreakable status within the vast annals of international military history. The deeply strained political relationship between the protective Australian government and the British High Command reached a decisive climax regarding the besieged garrison. Prime Minister Arthur Fadden categorically demanded the immediate withdrawal of the completely exhausted 9th Australian Division from the horrific confines of Tobruk. Winston Churchill vehemently opposed this highly disruptive maneuver, desperately arguing that a complex maritime extraction would severely jeopardize the upcoming Allied desert offensive. However, the Australian leadership remained completely uncompromising, explicitly citing the profound physical deterioration and severe combat fatigue plaguing their elite frontline troops. Major General Leslie Morshead received the highly classified evacuation orders with a profound mixture of immense relief and heavy tactical apprehension. He fully recognized the extreme danger inherent in systematically withdrawing an entire military division from under the direct observation of a deeply entrenched enemy. The meticulous commander explicitly directed his staff to meticulously orchestrate a highly phased, completely covert withdrawal, entirely dependent on the darkest, moonless nights. Absolutely no discernible changes to the established defensive routines could be permitted, ensuring General Rommel remained completely oblivious to the massive troop rotation. Corporal Thomas O'Reilly and the surviving remnants of his battered infantry squad slowly navigated the completely ruined streets of the heavily bombarded town. They moved with absolute, strict silence toward the heavily damaged harbor facilities under the extremely protective cover of total, suffocating darkness. The metallic stench of recently exploded artillery shells heavily saturated the cool night air, serving as a grim reminder of the constant, lethal danger surrounding the extraction zone. The deeply exhausted soldiers tightly clutched their battered rifles, their worn boots shuffling softly across the deeply pulverized, cratered pavement. The incredibly courageous crews of the Royal Navy meticulously executed the perilous extraction operation, heavily risking their sleek destroyers in the shallow, mine-infested waters. Sleek, heavily armed warships silently glided into the dark harbor, their powerful engines muffled and all deck lights strictly extinguished to prevent enemy detection. The extremely urgent process of rapidly disembarking the fresh British and Polish replacement troops occurred simultaneously with the highly organized loading of the departing Australians. Every single second spent entirely stationary at the ruined docks massively increased the horrific probability of a devastating aerial attack. As O'Reilly cautiously stepped onto the heavily slanted steel deck of the waiting British destroyer, a profound wave of surreal disbelief washed over him. He instinctively glanced back toward the heavily contested defensive perimeter, visualizing the vast network of shallow trenches and deeply excavated subterranean bunkers. Leaving the horrific battlefield felt entirely unnatural after dedicating countless months to fiercely defending that barren stretch of completely unforgiving desert wasteland. He silently acknowledged the incredible bravery of the incoming Polish infantrymen who were actively inheriting the terrifying responsibility of holding the shattered perimeter. The most profoundly agonizing aspect of the massive maritime evacuation was the brutal necessity of abandoning their countless fallen comrades in the makeshift cemeteries. Thousands of brave Australian soldiers remained permanently buried beneath the extremely harsh, unforgiving sands of the completely devastated North African landscape. O'Reilly quietly touched the small, makeshift brass rat insignia securely pinned to his faded uniform, silently vowing to constantly remember the immense sacrifices made by his closest friends. The immense emotional burden of surviving the horrific siege weighed far heavier than his heavily loaded military canvas rucksack. Once the heavily loaded destroyer completely severed its mooring lines, it rapidly accelerated toward the relative safety of the open Mediterranean Sea. The deeply exhausted Australian soldiers tightly packed the narrow steel corridors and dimly lit cargo holds, collapsing into deeply profound, heavily uninterrupted sleep. For the first time in over 6 agonizing months, they were finally free from the terrifying, constant shriek of descending Stuka dive bombers and deafening artillery barrages. O'Reilly closed his heavily crusted eyes, the soothing, rhythmic vibration of the massive naval engines slowly easing his severely shattered nerves. Major General Morshead officially transferred the immense tactical command of the fiercely defended fortress to the British leadership before boarding his designated vessel. He took one final, highly analytical look at the completely ruined port facilities, fully knowing his magnificent division had successfully accomplished a genuine military miracle. They had completely neutralized the previously unstoppable mechanized momentum of the dreaded Afrika Korps, providing the battered British Army with desperately needed time to strategically rebuild. The strict, uncompromising commander felt incredibly profound pride for the legendary endurance displayed by his remarkable infantrymen. Shortly after the successful, highly covert extraction of the majority of the Australian forces, the massive Allied strategic counteroffensive officially commenced in late November. Codenamed Operation Crusader, this highly coordinated, massive armored push was explicitly designed to permanently shatter the German siege and heavily engage Rommel in open combat. Thousands of British tanks and motorized infantry units aggressively swept across the contested desert expanse, initiating a highly complex, deeply confusing series of massive armored engagements. The remaining Polish and British defenders within Tobruk simultaneously prepared to aggressively break out from the perimeter. The highly anticipated breakout from the besieged fortress completely synchronized with the massive external pressure heavily applied by the advancing 8th Army forces. The newly stationed Polish Carpathian Brigade fiercely assaulted the deeply entrenched Axis positions from within, violently attacking the heavily fortified German communication lines. The immense operational chaos severely fractured the previously organized defensive lines of the besieging army, forcing General Rommel into a highly desperate, rapid strategic withdrawal. The extremely fragile, highly contested corridor linking the isolated garrison to the advancing Allied main force was finally, triumphantly established amidst heavy combat. By the second week of December 1941, the historically momentous, brutal Siege of Tobruk was definitively and completely broken by the Allied forces. The incredibly stubborn Axis forces were forcefully driven completely away from the critical port facilities, rapidly retreating westward across the unforgiving Libyan desert landscape. The immensely vital deep-water harbor was finally entirely secured for massive Allied logistical operations, completely altering the strategic supply dynamics of the entire theater. The horrific, grinding war of attrition had finally concluded, marking a massive turning point in the vast desert campaign. The incredibly profound historical legacy of the monumental defense fundamentally transformed global military perceptions regarding the previously terrifying German mechanized blitzkrieg tactics. The magnificent 9th Australian Division had irrefutably proven that highly disciplined, fiercely determined infantry could successfully halt heavily armored, rapidly advancing panzer formations. Their highly innovative, incredibly aggressive defensive strategies completely rewrote established military doctrines, explicitly demonstrating the absolute necessity of utilizing deep defenses and continuous nocturnal patrolling. Major General Morshead's incredibly brilliant tactical execution provided a crucial, highly studied blueprint for effectively neutralizing modern, heavily mechanized enemy assaults. Beyond the massive strategic implications, the successful defense generated an absolutely immense psychological victory for the entirely embattled Allied nations worldwide. During a deeply bleak period completely dominated by horrific military defeats, the incredibly stubborn resistance offered a profound, desperately needed beacon of immense hope. The proudly adopted moniker of the fiercely defiant Rats of Tobruk became completely synonymous with absolute, unbreakable military resilience and extraordinary physical endurance. They had completely shattered the terrifying myth of absolute German invincibility, proving the formidable Afrika Korps could absolutely be definitively beaten in sustained combat. Corporal Thomas O'Reilly spent several quiet weeks slowly recovering in a heavily sterilized military hospital located securely within the bustling city of Alexandria. He steadily regained his severely depleted physical strength, consuming highly nutritious meals, and finally receiving proper medical treatment for his painful, festering desert sores. However, the immense psychological scars heavily inflicted by the horrific violence of the salient stubbornly refused to completely heal. Despite the profound physical comfort, the terrifying auditory memories of massive artillery bombardments frequently interrupted his sleep, forcing him to abruptly awaken in completely terrified, freezing sweat. Surrounded by his fiercely loyal, surviving comrades, O'Reilly frequently reflected on the immense power of the unique camaraderie that had guaranteed their ultimate survival. The extraordinary bond deeply forged in the suffocating heat of the completely devastated limestone trenches completely transcended traditional military discipline or basic patriotic duty. They had fought primarily for each other, heavily relying on deeply ingrained mutual trust to successfully endure the seemingly impossible, completely unbearable physical hardships. This profoundly unique brotherhood fundamentally defined the entire Australian military experience throughout the incredibly brutal, deeply unforgiving North African campaign. The comprehensive military history of the Second World War permanently recorded the legendary siege as a truly foundational moment of absolute Allied defiance. The incredible bravery displayed by the deeply exhausted garrison completely captivated the global public, heavily dominating countless international newspaper headlines for several consecutive months. Military academies worldwide meticulously studied the brilliant defensive fortifications and highly aggressive patrol tactics expertly utilized by the completely isolated, heavily outnumbered Australian infantrymen. The deeply ruined desert town permanently became a highly revered, sacred symbol of immense sacrifice and truly extraordinary, unbreakable human endurance. It remains absolutely crucial to continuously acknowledge the immense, highly perilous contributions provided nightly by the incredibly courageous sailors of the Mediterranean supply fleet. Without their deeply dangerous, highly covert nocturnal deliveries of vital ammunition and strictly rationed supplies, the defiant garrison would have inevitably starved into complete surrender. The so-called inshore squadron suffered incredibly severe naval casualties, heavily losing numerous vital ships to accurate Axis aerial bombardments and heavily concealed underwater minefields. Their completely unwavering, highly dedicated support was absolutely instrumental in successfully maintaining the fiercely stubborn defense of the besieged port. Even the highly respected German commander, General Erwin Rommel, publicly expressed a profound, deeply genuine professional admiration for his incredibly stubborn, fiercely defiant adversaries. He explicitly noted in his private, highly detailed military journals that the deeply entrenched Australian troops were undoubtedly the most formidable infantrymen he had encountered. The renowned Desert Fox completely recognized that their highly aggressive combat style and complete refusal to ultimately surrender had significantly derailed his massive strategic ambitions. This heavily guarded respect from a truly brilliant enemy commander further solidified the absolutely legendary historical reputation of the defending garrison. The completely extraordinary endurance of the legendary Rats of Tobruk remains a deeply powerful, enduring testament to the absolute limits of sheer human willpower. Corporal Thomas O'Reilly and his fiercely defiant comrades successfully faced an incredibly terrifying, heavily mechanized enemy amidst the most horrifically unforgiving environmental conditions imaginable. Their ultimate, highly celebrated survival fundamentally altered the completely desperate trajectory of the entire global conflict, providing crucial strategic momentum for the advancing Allied armies. The profoundly brave defense of that devastated desert fortress will forever remain an incredibly magnificent, proudly remembered chapter of military history. As the vast, unforgiving desert sands slowly reclaimed the heavily shattered concrete pillboxes and deeply excavated trenches, the incredibly quiet landscape completely hid the violence. The deeply tragic, monumental loss of life profoundly scarred the barren terrain, leaving a truly silent, immensely powerful memorial to the incredibly brave fallen soldiers. The profoundly moving historical memory of the fiercely defiant Australian garrison strictly ensures their immense, unbelievable sacrifices will absolutely never be entirely forgotten by future generations. The legendary, unbreakable spirit of the magnificent Rats of Tobruk firmly stands as an eternal beacon of absolute, unmatched military courage.